Welcome to the Stoic Responder Podcast. I'm your host, Christopher Healy. As a special agent who spent more than 15 years conducting large-scale fraud, money laundering, and public corruption investigations, Stoic philosophy provided a mindset edge that became the foundation of my professional success. My mission today is to share those same ancient mindset lessons with you so that you can turn obstacles into opportunities and adversity into advantage. Time to muster up. All right, folks, welcome back to the Stoic Responder Podcast. This is episode 33, and I'm your host, Christopher Healy. Title of today's episode, Get Off the Treadmill. As I'm recording this, I'm looking over to my right-hand side, and I've got a brand new treadmill sitting over there. It was my Father's Day gift. It is a commercial-grade Nordic track treadmill, and it replaces a treadmill that I spent 15 plus years and I don't know how many thousand miles running on. We had a Nordic track that we got from my in-laws. I have a hand-me-down. They had gotten it for Christmas one year, never used it. My wife and I took it over to our house in like 2008. And that thing we kept for many, many years and each of us trained for 6 Ironmans on it and a bunch of ultra marathons and half Ironmans, you name it. Thousands of miles on that treadmill before it finally gave up, before it finally had enough and had to be replaced. So this is a great title of an episode because I know from which I speak when I talk about treadmills. So anyway, speaking of treadmills, there is this psychological theory called the hedonic treadmill. It's a reference to hedonism. We won't get into the philosophy of hedonism. You probably know what it is, or at least when you hear the word hedonism, you probably have a association with it. Well, the hedonic treadmill describes the tendency of humans to return to a relatively stable level of happiness or satisfaction following temporary changes in life circumstances. In other words, we can turn the speed of our happiness up or down with our pursuits of pleasure, but in the end, we just keep running in place, if that makes sense. So, the hedonic treadmill essentially says you're going to run at a faster pace at various times. You're going to slow back down, and all of it comes down to this pursuit of pleasure. That's what hedonism is, right? So I'm going to start you off with a quote, and then we're going to talk about this hedonic treadmill and how we get off of this sucker. So Seneca tells us difficulties strengthen the mind as labor does the body. All right, this makes sense, right? We talk a lot about adversity on this podcast. We talk a lot about the idea that having some adversity in your life, going into your life and finding some challenges, some difficult things to do can create not a life of more ease, but it can make the hard times easier, right? I saw a great quote actually on the back of someone's t-shirt at Disney World this past week. And it said, the world is going to make waves. You can drown or you can surf. It's kind of that idea, right? Difficulties strengthen the mind. Like adversity is going to strengthen the mind in the same way that hard work, that lifting weights, that working out in the gym, that running on a treadmill is going to strengthen the body. But how do we get off this hedonic treadmill? How do we get off this treadmill of happiness, satisfaction, pleasure, back to base, that sort of thing, right? Well, we get off of that by focusing on different pursuits that are not hedonistic, but that are instead eudaimonic. Now, eudaimonic happiness is first described by Aristotle. It's described by the Greeks. It's this idea that we live a life of virtue and excellence, and we strive to fulfill our potential every single day, and we achieve a sense of fulfillment and meaning that way instead of pursuing these moments of pleasure, these moments of satisfaction. We focus on living a life of virtue and excellence every single day, which keeps us more fulfilled longer, right? It gives us more meaning in our lives. So Seneca spoke a lot about eudaimonia, and he believed that willingly subjecting himself to challenges and hardships was the path to achieve it. Just like we're talking about here with this quote, difficulties strengthen the mind. Well, that is how we achieve a greater sense of fulfillment, a greater sense of meaning, is by subjecting ourselves to greater and greater challenges and hardships. Seneca isn't the only person who talked about this. Tim Ferriss, if you've ever listened to his podcast, if you've ever read The 4-Hour Work Week, he's expressed a similar belief in seeking out and embracing challenges as a means to expand our comfort zone. See, most people don't ever get outside their comfort zone, but what happens is your comfort zone can be expanded. You can learn to be comfortable in harder situations, and catalyze a deeper level of happiness than your hedonic pursuits are going to provide by becoming more uncomfortable more often. You find greater satisfaction in the little things when you've experienced discomfort in your life. And this doesn't have to be like, you don't have to get thrown in jail, right? This can be the discomfort of doing a hard thing, signing up for a marathon, doing a hard race, getting outside your comfort zone and catalyzing a deeper level of happiness because you've experienced the growth that comes with being uncomfortable. You see, hedonic happiness prioritizes the pursuit of a temporary pleasure. Think of it like food, sex, alcohol, catching a buzz, getting drunk, getting high, whatever it is. That is a hedonic temporary pleasure. And it also emphasizes the avoidance of pain. So it keeps that comfort zone that you're in very, very small. And that's what we mean by that hedonic treadmill. You get outside of it to, you go chase that pleasure very quickly, but you're right back here. So you're only leaving for this temporary pleasure at the avoidance of pain. And that creates a lack of growth, right? Eudaimonia emphasizes living a life of virtue, of meaning, of personal growth through difficulty, through discipline. I talk about this in my newsletter this week. If you subscribe to the Substack, you got this on Monday. If you subscribe to my newsletter on LinkedIn, you got the same thing on Monday. We talk about what Epictetus says when he says 2 words are more important than any other: persist and resist. Because the 2 greatest character flaws are a lack of endurance, a lack of tenacity, and an inability to discipline and control ourselves. Those 2 things, those character flaws, lead to most of our problems. And that's what the hedonic treadmill really is. It's an inability to persist through difficulty. It's an inability to resist the temporary pleasure center, that buzz you want to catch, whatever it is. If you can persist through adversity, if you can resist the temporary, you gain greater awareness. You get closer to that eudaimonic happiness, that life of virtue, that life of meaning, that life of personal growth through difficulty, through discipline, through persisting and resisting. You see, hedonism may lead to short-term gratification. It certainly does. I mean, anybody who's had a good time after having a couple of beers knows what I'm talking about, right? That short-term gratification, that can be fun. Hedonism is fun. There's no doubt about it. But what can lead to short-term gratification, it rarely is going to bring a deeper and more enduring sense of fulfillment. That is what eudaimonic happiness is. And that is how you break the hedonic cycle of temporary pleasure back to comfort zone, temporary pleasure back to comfort zone. If you want to increase your comfort zone, if you want to be happier in a more fulfilled and long-term way, if you want to get off that hedonic treadmill, you have to stop chasing temporary pleasure and focus instead on long-term goals, on living a life of virtue and meaning and pursuit of not temporary pleasures, but pursuit of greatness, pursuit of a greater version of you. And that comes from persisting through difficult times and resisting the temporary short-term pleasure that keeps you running on the hedonic treadmill. So I want you to ask yourselves, this is the journal quote that I'm gonna leave, journal quote, journal prompt I'm gonna leave you with today. Ask yourself, am I running on that hedonic treadmill? Am I focused on the short term? Am I focused on chasing temporary pleasure instead of living a life of virtue and meaning, instead of having long-term goals, instead of turning down the temporary? You see, we talked about this past week. We had an episode called Will It Make the Boat Go Faster? That is a classic example of how guys got off that hedonic treadmill and used it to achieve something incredibly great, to live a life of true value, a life of meaning. They did that by getting off the hedonic treadmill. Somebody would ask them, you want to go out and have drinks tonight? That temporary pleasure impact of chasing that buzz, that's great in the moment. But what was the impact of that on their training for the Olympics, right? If they could say no, if they could resist the temporary and persist on the long-term goal, they would achieve greater things. That's how you get off that hedonic treadmill. So I want you to ask yourself, are you running on that hedonic treadmill? Are you living for the next buzz, the next the next girl you meet at the bar, the next, temporary pleasure. Is that what you're living on? Or are you living on something greater, something bigger? Are you persisting and are you resisting? That's what I got for you this week, folks. That's 4 episodes this week, plus the bonus episode with Jeff Fields. Check it out if you want to hear our take on DHS, on the federal response to the assassination attempt this past weekend. We break it down because the two of us were both DHS, OIG special agents. We investigated failures within DHS, and there hasn't been a bigger failure within DHS than the events of this past Saturday. So we break it all down, what you can expect, what's happening behind the scenes, what's going to happen next, where the investigation will go, and to the extent possible, what we think can be done about it to make it better in the future. So if you want to check that out, that's the bonus episode that's out there for you. But there's some ways that you can support this podcast if you're enjoying the content. The easiest, simplest way is get on and give this thing a 5-star review, like, share, and subscribe so that others can find it. If you want to help us with a little bit of, cash in my pocket, you can pick up a copy of my book, In Valor, 365 Stoic Meditations for First Responders. It's available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, anywhere you want to get your books. You can actually send me a message, and I can send you a signed copy as well. I do have some here and available for signature. That book is, it's going to give you some tools to practice these theories that we talk about in this podcast. It's very similar. It's going to be kind of a companion piece to this podcast. It's going to give you prompts, action items, daily journals. It's going to give you relatable content and contextualization. They're going to help you integrate these lessons and become more virtuous, to live that life of greater comfort, because you're expanding that comfort zone by stopping chasing those temporary pleasures. So check those things out, folks, if you want to support this podcast, you're enjoying the content. And that is where I will leave you. Get out there until Tuesday. Get out there, live your lives with valor. Hopefully we don't have a weekend like we had this past weekend. But until next time, you are out of roll. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to subscribe, like, rate, and share this podcast so that we can spread the benefits of Stoicism to other first responders. It will only take you a few moments, but it can help us tremendously. Until next time, out of roll.